What we do here is go back.
Hi, and welcome to Mr. Toyama's AP World History. This is Chapter 28, Revolutions and National States in the Atlantic World. First up, we have the overview. The year 1776 and 1789 are pivotal dates in world history. The impact of the American Revolution and the French Revolution extended far beyond the borders of those two countries. Other revolts followed, and in spite of a conservative reaction in Europe, the world was not the same afterward. Common elements of the revolutionary era include the following. Number 1, new ideals. The ideals of freedom, equality, and popular sovereignty, first expressed by the philosophies of the Enlightenment, see Chapter 23, were now enacted. John Locke's theory of government, as a contract between rulers and subjects, inspired the leaders of the American Revolution. Likewise, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's concept of a social contract based on the general will found expression in the National Assembly in France. Number 2, new governments. Vastly different governments emerged in the U.S., France, and Latin America. However, most revolutionary governments began with written constitutions, statements of individual rights, and elected assemblies. Political power was generally the privilege of men and property. Only Haiti empowered all men regardless of race. New ideologies. Political theories emerged to address the dramatic changes of the age. Conservatism, liberalism, and later socialism differed in the understanding of change and authority and came to express the social and economic currents of the 19th century. Number 4, uneven social progress. Some changes such as the abolition of feudal rights and obligations in France were profound and permanent. Other changes like the abolition of slavery in the Americas came more slowly and piecemeal. Equal rights for women did not gain momentum until the late 19th century. And finally, nationalism. The popular sovereignty gave voice to a new form of identity. Based on notions of a common cultural and historic experience, nationalism was a powerful force in the 19th century. Ethnic minorities like the Greeks within the Ottoman Empire demanded national independence, and scattered cultural groups like the Italians and the Germans created new states to house their national identities. So before we begin, I'd like to show you something that helps me to understand this chapter. It's a grid that I created. It has the 4 major movements of revolutions that we're going to be talking about in this chapter. And then I wanted to put on the left-hand side the ideals of philosophies that kind of involved or moved the specific revolutions forward. Then I talked about the main issues that each revolution was facing and why it was facing what it was facing, leading to its change. And then finally, I talk about the major actions that were inside of it with the outcomes that resulted from those revolutions. So this is a helpful way for me to organize it. You don't have to do this, but this is a way that I like to think about it. Popular sovereignty. Ancient and medieval notions of kingship, specifically the mandate of heaven and the divine right of kings. We've talked about this before, how these are two different ideas that come together that kind of embody similar sentiments, that the heavens above, or God, or a divine ruler in the sky is in charge of the universe. And as a result of being in charge of the universe, one of the things that he or she or it does is in place into societies and into the world certain leaders for its group. In the mandate of heaven, we talked about how in China specifically that the emperor was like a catalyst or a go-between, a conduit for the heavens above and the people below, and the son of heaven through the mandate of heaven was the ruler by the fact that they were in charge, and to question them would be unheard of because you would be questioning the god or gods above. The divine right of kings talks about in Europe how originally, way back, somebody did something heroic or was from a noble line or can trace themselves back to Roman history or some sort of divine or noble status. And from there, their progeny and offspring are the ones who are now in charge of our area or the areas around us. And as a result, there is a divine right that by disagreeing with those kings or by fighting back against those kings, you would be disobeying God. So your job as a good citizen or a good Christian, or however you'd like to look at it, was to honor those kings and to pledge oath and allegiance to them. Now, we talked about the Enlightenment ideas from before and how there was a big push towards logic, reason, and questioning of specific ideas, and mainly these divine right of kings. The people started to ask, why are kings not being made to be responsible to subject populations? If the king is in charge, should not the king have their power almost balanced by the people? Or is it that the king is in charge and really he's not in charge because of the historical precedent that was set by him and his father and so on and so forth before him, but is he really in charge because we allow him to be in charge? Specifically, John Locke, the philosopher pictured here, wrote a book called The Second Treatise of Civil Government in 1690, and he argues that rulers actually derive their power from the consent of the ruled. What this means is that the people actually give the ruler some of their freedom in exchange for safety, and by giving them this exchange, the people actually give the king the power to make laws, enact certain actions on their behalf in an effort to protect them from others and protect them from one another and to protect their rights. But this is only done through consent, meaning by giving freely. What could eventually happen is that people could, if they felt, not need these rulers, and they could actually violate this process by going back and saying, hey, we need you, the ruler, to actually be subject to what we say and not just do whatever you think is right. Individuals, though, retain personal rights, specifically rights that were given to them in John Locke's view from above, through heaven or from nature or creator, or however you want to look at it, that these rights were inalienable, meaning they could not be taken away just by the whim of some ruler, but that they were always retained by the people and kept. So, for example, the freedom of speech is one that we talk about in the United States as being an inalienable right, a right that you are given no matter what, and no matter what the government says, you can't have this violated because the government is subject to the people, and as a result, the leaders can't make laws that violate those personal rights. We do, however, in John Locke's view, give political rights to rulers. The right to, for example, make laws and collect taxes and raise armies and buy goods and services with our taxes to protect the people and our society. So this is starting to seep into society very heavily. We also talk about individual freedoms. One of my favorite people, Voltaire, with a pen name of François-Marie Arouet, in 1694 to 1778, talks about his distaste for the Catholic Church and its power over the individuals living in Europe. He sees the Roman Catholic Church as almost a backwards institution, an institution that is not in favor of logic, it's not in favor of progress, it's not in favor of moving society forward through the use of science and reason, but instead he says that people are stuck in their superstition and their dogma. And one of the things that he is known for saying is écraser l'infamie. I think that's how you say it in French. Erase the infamy. It's a criticism of Catholic Church that we need to stop listening as a society to the Catholic Church and what they think and what they say, but really use our own judgment, logic, reason to understand our world and what is best for each and every one of us. At the same time, there's a man named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, who argues for equality of all individuals, regardless of class, before the law. That society actually should not be structured into classes of rich, poor, noble, non-noble, peasant classes, etc., but that all people retain certain rights, and equality before the law means that they should be treated in the same way. We talked about in the past, for example, the Code of Hammurabi, and how in the Code of Hammurabi, when you look at the text, it actually says that if you are a noble person and you commit a specific crime, you're given one punishment. While if you are a peasant or a slave, you are given a separate punishment for the same crime. Rousseau would have said this was wrong because all humans are essentially the same, regardless of our man-made institutions of class. He comes up with the idea of the social contract in 1762 and argues that society is collectively the sovereign. As society was formed, we had to choose leaders, and we had to choose people to take up certain jobs. Then Rousseau argues that the social contract is a contract that our society has implicitly agreed to, that we have given up certain rights, just like John Locke had said, but he argues that the society is really the one in charge. The ruler is not in charge. He is only in charge because we allow him to be in charge. And if at any time we would like to violate this social contract, we may, only if the king is violating specific things such as denying us our inalienable rights, if they are stopping us from enacting our freedoms as he saw it. And in reality, this contract is basically like a contract you'd think in like law or legal terms. As long as both parties keep up their end of the bargain, the contract is not violated. But if any time one party violates the other contract, then all rules are off. So Rousseau would have been in favor, for example, of overthrow of the government if the government was to become tyrannical or to be destructive to the ends of freedom that we see as inalienable. We then get a revolution in America. There's little indication of the forthcoming revolution around the mid-18th century. The 13 colonies saw themselves as British subjects. We talked about colonies forming in Africa and around the world as a part of the British Empire, and they saw themselves living just in a new location but still subject to the British crown. Long cultural and personal connections with England. Many of these people living here had come over on the original Mayflower, had seen themselves as British subjects and citizens, and one of the things that they really helped dearly was that they were a very good economic relationship through triangle trade. If you think back to our discussion about the triangle trade system that was set up through the British and Europeans sending goods to Africa, manufactured goods specifically, then taking slaves from Africa and trading the manufactured goods to Africa, and then taking some of the slaves into the New World. Those slaves then are dropped off in the Americas, where they are put on plantations to create and grow and cultivate and collect natural resources such as sugarcane, tobacco, rum, and those things are brought back to England and Europe for processing into manufactured goods. An economic, mutually profitable relationship. At the same time, the Americas were a military relationship that the British saw as very valuable. They were able to keep many of the Spanish that were occupying the New World at a certain distance. They were also able to keep back some of the French claims that had been going on in the New World. And as Britain and France had basically a economic and political rivalry through this time period, we see that America kind of plays a pivotal role in the New World and protecting its colony and its claims during this time. We then get to the French and Indian War in 1754 through 1763. It's called the French and Indian War not because the French fought the Indians, but because the French and the Indians fought the Americans and the British. It was expensive and extensive. It covered multiple theaters, meaning it was all over the globe. It was one of the most expensive wars of its time. It overlapped with the 7 Years' War that had already been going on for a little bit afterwards in 1756. And there's conflict in Europe, in India, and the British victory ensured global dominance with North American prosperity. This might be considered one of the first world wars where European powers were fighting in multiple areas of the globe, fighting one another over colonies and over land. And this French and Indian War leads to one specific thing, a large amount of debt for Britain and for France. Well, in the 1760s, there's an increase in taxation. The bills come due from the 7 Years' War, and the tax burden falls on the colonies. The argument goes like this. The British say, look, America, you are the ones who were being protected. We, the good British people over in England, could have let you all got shot up by some Native Americans and by some French people, but what we did is we sent over some troops and some guns and some boats and some supplies, and we helped protect you. So really, the bill is yours, and you need to pay it back. And the taxes originally start off pretty mild. The Sugar Act in 1764 places a tax on all sugar that's imported into the colonies and out of the colonies. There's a Stamp Act, which says that all papers that are of legal documents, such as marriage certificates, wedding certificates, well, those are the same things, divorce papers, which are very rare, contracts between businesses, had to have what's called a stamp of approval. Basically, you paid some taxes, you got a stamp, and it was a legally binding contract. Without the stamp, it wasn't legally binding, and so it could cause lots of problems legally for certain people. From there, the Americans start to say, hey, wait, slow down. This isn't fair. We didn't ask to be protected, and we didn't really need your protection, they felt. And what they decided to do was say, we're not going to pay these taxes. This is unfair. And at the same time, the Americans were saying, if we are going to be paying taxes, shouldn't we be having the same rights as those who pay taxes in England? And so if you look at England and you look at, for example, the city of Manchester, the people who live in Manchester, they pay taxes to Parliament, and Parliament gives them a representative in their Parliament to argue on their behalf of their well-being and what they need as a colony, or as a city within England. The Americans were saying, we don't have any representation. No one asked us if we wanted these taxes. Nobody argued or lobbied on our behalf. So this is unfair. We want taxation only if we have representation in Parliament. From there, we get what's known as the Quartering Act. 1765, the housing of British troops. Now, this was especially upsetting because many Americans saw that they had come to the New World to have some sense of space, some freedom, some ability to be away from the overarching view or gaze of the British government. And now the British are saying that you need to, as American colonists, allow British troops to stay in your home. And as a part of staying in your home, you need to feed them, you need to provide housing for them, warmth, you need to spend money to keep our troops there because they're protecting you from the Native Americans and the French. Well, the Americans see it as almost like an occupation. And they say, we don't want these troops living in our home. This is upsetting. And then there is the Tea Act, which places a tax on tea coming into the Americas. British people drink lots of tea, and Americans, as seeing themselves as British, started to drink or were drinking lots of tea at the time. And for every bit of tea that goes with their morning routine or their afternoon relaxing time, they felt this was unfair. This is a good that they use. This is something that they enjoy. And it's not right that the British just have decided that only people who are going to pay this tax on tea is the American colonists. Then we get to the Declaration of Independence. The British products are boycotted and officials are attacked. They say that we need to have this representation, and the king is starting to sound a lot like the king from some of the books we've been reading by Locke and Rousseau and Voltaire, and we're starting to see that these ideas of social contract and these ideas of consent of the governed are not being recognized, that the king is doing whatever he wants, and we as his subjects and citizens are not being heard. And so this is becoming more and more unfair. They then have the Boston Tea Party, the colonists, in 1773, where tea is dumped into Boston Harbor in protest against the Tea Act, and there they say no taxation without representation in Parliament. The Continental Congress is then formed in 1774. It coordinates the colonists' resistance to British policies. Representatives from the 13 original colonies come together, and they say, we need to organize and make sure that the British hear us, and if they want to tax something, we're going to organize to make sure that they aren't successful at taxing us. We need to become structured in a way that brings us together so that it's more effective. And on July 4, 1776, they adopt what's called the Declaration of Independence. It starts off with the line, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it goes on to discuss how when a government becomes tyrannical or destructive to these original ideals that started the Declaration of Independence, that it is not just the right, but the duty of people to actually overthrow their government and institute for themselves a new government based on the consent of the governed. So what they're actually doing is saying, hey, you really need to listen to us. You're violating our human rights, and by violating our human rights, we're saying to you, we don't recognize you as a leader, and you can no longer rule us. The influence of Locke is pretty much all throughout. There is a retention of individual rights, that when the sovereign is given his power through this contract and this not the social contract, but the giving up of rights as a part of instituting a government, that the people actually retain specific individual rights that the government has no right to take away. And they talk about the sovereignty based on the consent of the rule, that only the king has the right to rule because the people have given him that specific right. Well, at the time, there was divided loyalties. There were those who were known as patriots, those who supported the revolution in the majority. Many did actually support the revolution. There were loyalists, also known as Tories. There was estimated 20% of the white population that remained loyal to the British monarchy. Wasn't a very popular opinion, so it was oftentimes very hard to see them as being very open about their loyalty to the crown. There were neutrals, specifically Quakers, religious Protestants who believed that violence and war was basically against the gospel that Jesus was teaching, and as a result, they felt that they couldn't pick a side, and so they will always resist violence. And this war that they felt was coming, they did not want to have any part of. And they were divided groups, specifically Native Americans and African Americans. The reason they were divided was because some groups were willing to listen to the claims by both sides. Both the British and the colonists, specifically the Patriots, told those individuals, look, Native Americans, if you side with us, the Americans, we will stop encroaching on your lands. We're having this problem with the British people that live far away. We'll give you specialized protection, but you can't side with the British, and you actually have to help us fight them. the British were saying, hey, look, the Americans, they're not going to keep their promises. Every time we told them not to go farther, they just kept going and taking your land and kicking you farther west. You need to side with us, and we'll basically get rid of them, and then we'll move them out, because obviously this experiment of having colonies over there isn't working. We'll give you back the land. Now, neither side really believed that they were going to do this, and so some Native Americans joined one side, some joined the other side. It split many Native American communities in half. African Americans, on the other hand, specifically slaves that had come to the New World as slaves, were told a number of things. The African Americans were told, specifically slaves, that if you side with us, the patriots, then we will give you your freedom. If you fight for the cause of freedom, we're going to start a whole new country, and in that, we'll let you go free, and it will be a great day for you and your descendants, because we'll stop this whole slavery thing. Now, they didn't actually intend that, but they thought it was better than having slave revolts during their time. The British, on the other hand, said, look, the Americans just keep importing more and more slaves. What you need to do is side with us British, and in Britain, we will bring you back to Britain and we'll free you. And you can live here in England, or you can live in one of our colonies, and we'll let you be free. Now, again, both sides did not believe this, but they were told similar stories by both sides. In the Revolutionary War, there were a couple advantages and disadvantages. For the colonies, there was a logistic advantage. They were on home turf. If you're trying to fight a war and you are an invading army, you have a very hard time because you don't know the land as well as the people who live there. You don't know about all the back alleys and all the like ridges and hills and choke points on roads. And the colonies had that knowledge because it was their home. And when you're fighting for your home, you're going to fight a lot harder than an army who doesn't really have any ties to the land they're invading. There was popular support. Many colonists were reading similar books by Locke and Voltaire and Rousseau and some of the other people like by Thomas Hobbes. And what they were starting to see is that, yes, there is a new spirit of ideas, and we need to embrace these. And as a result of that, they saw that they needed to really just side with the Patriots because maybe they can make a whole new country based on a whole new set of ideas, and they can form it however they want. The support of British rivals. Many European countries saw Britain's conflict with its colonies as a way to exploit a weakness that the British had. So the French, for example, sided with the colonists during the war. And George Washington was a very, very charismatic and imaginative military leader who did many brave and heroic and outside-the-box thinking when it came to fighting the war. And he was a very crafty general. He was one of the biggest problems for the British because of his ingenuity and his ability to fight wars. He had fought in the French and Indian War, had been captured, and after his time during that, he was appointed as general and commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and he had a number of setbacks because of the Continental Congress, but in all, he was one of the best leaders during this time. Britain, on the other hand, had a strong central government. They had the money, they had the taxes, they had the colonies. Really, it wasn't real about the lack of bureaucracy or logistics. What they had was overwhelming amounts of money and force. They also had a full-time navy. The Americans basically created what are known as privateers, pirates, that if you were a American colonist and you decided that you and your friends wanted to go attack a small British ship and you were able to kill all the people on board and take the ship, well, you can have that ship. You're on the side of American Revolution, even if you were just doing it for the money. Whereas the British Navy were well-trained, well-organized, had very large boats with many cannons. They also had a standing army, meaning an army of trained professional soldiers who had been given boot camp and been given the ability to use their weapons effectively. And for British, they had the loyalist population. They had people they could trust to give them information about the colonists and where they were meeting and some of the problems that they might face if they went into certain areas. And it kind of created a lack of advantage for the colonists because now they have people who walk the same roads and know the same hills and are able to tell them where, for example, a group of people are staying that are hiding guns that might attack British soldiers. So here is the American Revolution map. The Spanish territories in orange, 13 British colonies that are in revolt are in yellowish beige. Quebec, under the Quebec Act, is in 1774 in green, and purple is other British possessions. There are major battles in the American Revolution. In the little explosions, there's For example, Boston, around the Boston area, there's Concord, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, Germantown, Jamestown, Yorktown, and Camden. The building an independent state. War weariness sets in by 1780. They had been fighting this war for a number of years, and the British forces are slowly being worked down. The Americans, at the very beginning, were very ineffective and kind of terrible at fighting the war. But they adopt this new policy of guerrilla-style tactics where they basically would hide in the forests and ambush British soldiers and then run away. Remember, at the time, they only had weapons that were basically one-shot muskets. They would have to fire, and then it could take them up to a minute to reload, even with some of the best people doing the reloading. Well, by the middle of the war, the Americans actually get a lot of support from the French. They get a lot of logistical support, more goods, more ammo, and just supplies in general from France. And basically by 1781, the British are surrounded in the city of Yorktown, Virginia, and there's a surrender in October 1781. The military conflict ceases, and there's a treaty in the Peace of Paris signed in 1783. There's a recognition of American independence, that the Americans are free to be their own country. They are no longer a colony of Britain. In 1787, the Constitution of the United States is drafted, and it sets up a political and legal equality for all men of property. Their belief was that in politics and before the law, all men who own land were to be seen as equals. Now, the reason that it was all men is there was this notion that men were special and unique compared to women, not very enlightened, but it was something to start with, and they only saw men as being white males who were not slaves. So slaves would not have been a part of that. And property. The land requirement was a belief that if there are to be laws enacted and taxes to be raised, many times it would be based on land, and you needed to have people who were land owners to be able to make those decisions because it would basically affect them the most. If given an option between giving more homework or less homework, if you ask most teachers, they would oftentimes say more because it doesn't really affect them. Whereas if you ask students if there should be more homework or less homework, many times students will vote for less homework because it actually affects them in the same way that raising taxes on land would affect mostly people of property. This was the original intent and understanding. There were some ideas of racism and classism built into it, but I would argue mostly they were looking at it from a logical and reasonable standpoint from their worldview at the time. The French Revolution starts. There were serious fiscal problems in France, specifically war debts. After the 7 Years' War and supporting the American Revolution, and in the 1780s, 50% of tax revenues just went to pay for war debts. 25% of tax revenues were just to the military. So that's 75% of taxes collected every year went to paying either a war that already had been fought or a military that was standing to prevent another war. This leads to 75% of the taxes not being used for the people and not being used to support social structures within France. This leads to a revolution more radical than the American. There's a repudiation of the many aspects of the ancien regime, or the ancient regime, or ancient order. Now, the old regime, the three estates. There are three estates that I want you guys to kind of keep an eye on. It's something that is a little more complicated and complex than we need to go into here, but it helps to understand how society was structured in France. They had what was called estates, or classes, or groups of people. The first estate was known as the Roman Catholic Church, or the clergy. They owned about 10% of the land in France. It provided education and relief services to the poor, and about 2% of its income went to the government. Not a lot for owning about 10% of the wealth in France at this time. The second estate were rich nobles, landed people who had titles and wealth from their family's history. Many of them paid no taxes. They were about 2% of the population and owned about 20% of the land. So between the top two, they own about 30% of the land and are some of the richest people living in France at the time. And then we get to the third estate, one of the lowest of the estates, and it has three subgroups within it. The 97% of people fell within the third estate. The first group was known as the bourgeoisie, or middle class. These were bankers, factory owners, merchants, professionals, skilled artisans, people who had a craft or a skill that provided them jobs. So, for example, a factory owner is somebody who organizes the factory. A merchant is somebody who buys and trades and sells. Professionals like lawyers and accountants, and skilled artisans such as bricklayers and masons and craftsmen who work with iron. They were well educated and believed in the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality. Many of them could read. Many of them had been reading some of the similar books that the American revolutionaries were reading. Some of the bourgeoisie were as rich as nobles, and they paid high taxes unlike the nobles, and lacked privileges, specifically voting rights and legal rights. So while they were as rich as nobles, they felt that they had a almost like non-value, even though they were contributing more to society in their eyes. Many felt their wealth entitled them to a greater degree of social status and political power. We then get the second group of the third estate, the workers in French City. They're the second and poorest group within the third estate. They were urban workers. They were tradespeople, apprentices, laborers, domestic servants. These are people who worked under these skilled artisans. Many of them were, for example, people who fed animals in a livestock yard. They were people who cleaned bathrooms and worked in people's homes. They got paid very little. They were frequently out of work because of there was no labor laws that protected them, and often went hungry because of France's inadequate social structure that was there to basically protect them. And finally, we get the third estate, which is the third group, the peasants. Peasants were the largest group within the third estate, more than 80% of France's 26 million people. The peasants paid about half their income in dues to nobles. They then also tied to the church, which made up that part of the half, and taxes to the king. Heavily taxed and discontented, the third estate was eager for change. Here's a little pyramid that I created. I would argue that the first estate and the second estate were almost on the same footing, so you might want to move the red square to the right or to the left, but this is a very simplified version of what was going on in France before the Revolution. The Estates General. There were three estates. The first estate was the Roman Catholic clergy, about 100,000. Second estate was the nobles, 400,000. Third estate, everyone else, 24 million serfs, free peasants, urban residents. The Estates General was founded in 1303 and had not met since 1614. There was a meeting and a system within the government of France that the king could call a meeting of the Estates General where representatives from each of the three estates could come together and help him basically vote on laws and restructure society. This is the only way certain things could happen, specifically taxes. The problem was it had not met since 1303 because the king was basically in charge by himself and had not met since it was founded in 1303 and had not met since 1614. And one of the biggest issues that people were having were that there was only one vote per estate. Now, that does not mean there was one vote per person as represented in the Estates General. What that meant was, as a group, the first estate got one vote at that meeting. The second estate got one vote at the meeting, and the third estate got one vote at the meeting. Now, if you were a clergy or nobleman, you pay very little in taxes. And with the third estate being called together to talk about raising taxes to pay off the debt that was incurred as a result of the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, you would most definitely have not voted to raise taxes, especially on yourself. So if you're the clergy, you will vote with the nobles, and it's very simple to see that they would collude or work together to make sure that if any taxes were enacted, they would only be enacted on the third estate. This was an unfair and unequal system according to those in the third estate, and it led to some problems at that specific meeting. Protests of nobility forces King Louis to call this Estates General for new taxes in 1789. The third estate demands greater social change, and in June, the third estate secedes. There's arguments that they were locked out of the meeting, but basically they decide to meet in a new place called the Tennis Court. And the third estate, with their representatives, come together and rename themselves the National Assembly. At the Tennis Court, they take what's called the Tennis Court Oath, where they vow to continue meeting as the new National Assembly, the representatives of the people, to form a new government and a new constitution based on ideals of the Enlightenment. Here's a famous picture showing that actual act. Kind of interesting and silly. In 1789, around July, a mob attacks what is known as the Bastille. It is a prison in the middle of Paris, and at the Bastille, there is number of guns and weapons and gunpowder inside of the Bastille. It was also a military base. If you think about it, you need to have guards who guard the prisoners, and so the best place to keep the guns would be near the guards, and it was also a giant castle with bricks around it, and it would be protected from people if they wanted to break in. Well, a mob breaks in and steals all the guns, thus right here starting the French Revolution. There then is a woman named Olympia de Gaulle, who starts to think about what does the new government look like. Well, as she's thinking about this, in August 1789, there's an American influence from the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution coming out, and a draft of a document written called the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen argues for the equality of men. Well, Olympia de Gaulle gets very upset by this and says, hey, why are women not included? And unsuccessfully attempts to redress this in 1791. There's an argument that the sovereignty resides in the people, that the people are the ultimate arbiters of what is the government should be organized around, and argues for individual rights guaranteed by a constitution that can never be taken away. There's a radicalization of the revolution. The motto of the revolution in France became liberty, equality, and fraternity, also known as brotherhood. The National Assembly, which is the group that was formed at the Estates General, abolishes the old social order. They actually get rid of the ancien regime, the old order. They take church lands and redefine clergy as citizens. They are no longer a special privileged class. The new constitution keeps the king, but is subject now to a legislative authority. There is now a governmental body, the National Assembly, that is going to approve and make laws, and the king's still there, but they are now looking at a group of people that represents the people rather than having the king act independently. They have a convention where people are elected by universal male suffrage, meaning all men in France that are citizens are given the vote, meaning that they can vote for people and they are elected to what is known as the convention. They also at this time create something called levée en masse, which is conscription for war, the right of the government to draft people to fight wars. It's not oftentimes. There are a lot of volunteers, and maybe a government might need more volunteers than it actually has to fight a war. So they create what's called levée en masse, that is the ability for the government to force people into the army. In 1793, King Louis and Marie Antoinette are found guilty of treason by trying to fight back against the revolution in a number of ways, and both are sent to the guillotine. It's a very large head-chopping machine that was created to make death more fair. Now, I had talked in the past a little bit about how there were a number of ways that people died. If you were just some peasant and the government was going to execute you as a result of capital punishment, there were a number of ways they could do it. One example was hanging. The problem with hanging, however, is that if you're not really fat, your neck might not completely snap when you're released, or if you're the thing holding you up is moved away from you. So you could hang there for a while, slowly suffocating and trying to catch your breath, and it could be torturous. Or, even worse, there were stories of people who were too heavy and the rope being too taut, and it basically ripping heads straight off of the shoulders of individuals. There were other examples of people being boiled alive and people being chopped into pieces and drawn and quartered, meaning they carved your body into 4 sections, and then they allowed horses to tear you apart into 4 different directions by tying you with ropes to those horses. Now, these were brutal and awful ways to die. The one way, however, that nobles were kept separate through this process was by beheading. Beheading was done by having an executioner with a very large axe or sword come to the noble, and what they would do is they would raise it up high and swing down while the neck is placed in front of them very low, and they would chop at the neck, and in one fell swoop, hopefully, they would chop the head off of a person. Now, this might seem very strange to have different structures of how people were to die based on their level of class, but we had talked about how laws were based and punishments were based on the class of the person who was living in the society. Now, if you were somebody who was a noble, many times you would want to make sure that you had the beheading, but you also wanted to have a couple of things. You wanted to have an executioner who wasn't drunk and not able to see your neck. You also wanted to make sure that the executioner was very good at aiming. If the executioner with his axe came down and hit you instead of in the neck where it's nice and soft, but hit you in the skull, the back of the head, they could actually get the axe stuck into your skull and have some problems there, or hit you in the shoulder where it gets stuck into your shoulder and you're now moving and bleeding. Also, you would want to make sure that your executioner had sharpened their blade. There are stories of people not having a single chop at their neck, but a number of chops until they finally died. Agonizing and brutal. The guillotine was designed by a doctor in France to be able to make death more equal. All people were to receive this execution style regardless of class during the French Revolution. The head would be placed inside of a binding kind of like stock system. The body would be strapped down to a board. They would be laid horizontally on their stomach, and then a blade with a weight would rise up above them in a track. And then the weighted blade had an angle to it, kind of like a knife, and it would drop, and by having that process, it would go cleanly, efficiently, and just chop your head off in one fell swoop. This was done in an effort to, surprisingly, give more equality even up to death. Kind of a crazy story. Maximilien Robespierre is the leader of the French Revolution early on, 1758 to 1794. He is known as the Incorruptible. He becomes the leader of what is known as the Committee for Public Safety. Their job was to create a safe world within France as the revolution was going on. He was the leader of a group known as the Jacobin Party. They dominated the convention. His group was pretty radical for what they wanted and some of the changes they wanted to French society. The churches were closed because him and his group thought that religion was antithetical, or the opposite of their new logic and reason-based Enlightenment society. Priests were forced to marry people as a way to force them to break their vows to God. They promoted what is called the cult of reason as a secular alternative to Christianity. They would go to, instead of church or to mass, they would go to book readings and discussions and debates on the popular ideas of the day. They would talk about science. They would build altars and monuments no longer to saints and to angels, but to famous scientists and philosophers. The calendar was even reorganized to 10 weeks and proclaimed the year 1 as a restarting of the whole order. The traditional BCE and CE calendar basically revolves around the birth of Jesus of Nazareth in the year probably 3, according to the new way we understand how the sun and moon and stuff works. They wanted to force people to not actually know when Christmas was, or Easter, or any of the religious holidays that people kept their clocks to, and also not allow them to know when Sunday was, so they didn't even know when the Sabbath was. By creating a 10-week structure, they were able to create new months, and it was based off of a very logical and simplified system. Think about the metric system and how logical that is. And they proclaim it year 1 in the same way that Jesus' birth, according to many Christians and to our world and how we understand the years, is structured. That is a time of change for the world. They saw the French Revolution as a restarting of all new things, and so they actually claimed that it was now the year 1. During his time as the leader for the Committee of Public Safety, 40,000 people were executed and over 300,000 were imprisoned, many on charges that were either made up, sometimes as simple as not being as excited about the revolution as somebody else. Sometimes it was based on rumors and hearsay. You didn't like your neighbor, so your neighbor you went to the police and said, hey, my neighbor says, Robespierre isn't a good leader. And the next day, some people from the Committee for Public Safety would collect them. They would arrest them, hold a trial that they would have no defense at, and they would be taken off to the guillotine and killed within 48 hours. This led to a time known as the Terror, a time when basically thousands died under the Committee for, quote, Public Safety. The Directory. Revolutionary enemies of the Jacobins start to say, hey, this is getting out of hand. Robespierre and his group is not really protecting us. They're not helping us. They're just fanatics that want to kill a ton of people. And this is not going well. So in 1794, Robespierre is arrested. And in his arresting, he knows that they're coming for him. So he takes a gun and shoots himself in the mouth. And before he is able to die, they actually hold a trial for him. He's unable to speak. They take him to the guillotine, and he dies as a result of it. Men of property take power in the form of the Directory. There's a new group that takes over, and they're known as the Directory. These are basically people who have influence, have wealth, many bourgeoisie. They're unable to still solve the economic and military problems of revolutionary France. One of the saddest parts about the French Revolution is that it didn't solve some of the original goals that it had begun at the outset. The French Revolution began because there was a ton of debt in France. Well, the debt never got paid, and they actually went to war with more countries as a result of this. People were unable to find food and bread, and the government wasn't able to provide that as well. There was a lack of rights, and under the Committee for Public Safety, you could argue that there wasn't a ton of rights being given out. While people might have thought they were free, they still had the problem that they could at any moment be taken and held without trial and basically killed. And they're kind of back to where they started. The king is gone. People with lots of money are in charge. They're still in debt, and the people are hungry. So the French Revolution did what many revolutions don't actually do, but it actually did what its title is known as. It revolved. It went 360 degrees back to where it started. Next, we get to Napoleon Bonaparte. From a minor Corsican noble family, he's an army officer under King Louis XIV and becomes general at age 24. He's known as a brilliant military strategist, and in 1799 he overthrows the Directory in basically saying that, look, the government has been taken over by some of the same people we were complaining about before. I, Napoleon alone, can take my army and get rid of these rich nobles and give back to the people of France that's worth living in. So if you think about it, we've gone through 4 phases in French government during this time. We go from the Ancien regime with King Louis XIV at the head in the original estate system. We then get to the Convention, which is the National Assembly, who has basically taken over during the French Revolution. We then get to the Directory after the death of Robespierre, and now we get what's known as the Consulate, which is ruled by Napoleon Bonaparte. Ironically, Napoleon crowns himself emperor in 1802. So we are now back to almost where we started, with one man in charge of all of France, still lots of debt, still many people unhappy, but lots of dead people. In Napoleonic France, however, Napoleon does make some good changes. He makes an agreement with the Pope called the Concordat in 1801. He says, sorry about what we did with the priests and forcing them to marry and taking church lands. Here's what we will do. France will keep the church lands, but we will pay salaries to the clergy and will make them ministers on government payrolls. He also sets up what's known as freedom of religion. He says, look, Catholic Church, you guys are great. We'll let you be in France, but we're also going to set up freedom of religion for any Protestants who want to live in France and also for Jews living in France. In 1804, he promulgates what's known as the Napoleonic Code, a new set of standardization and codification of laws. He sets up patriarchal authority in these Napoleonic codes, meaning that males are to be heads of their households, and a lot of the legal and financial dealings fall upon male heads of households. And it became model for many civil codes, even in the United States today. For example, Louisiana, the state, has a lot of Napoleonic codes still on its books. One thing that Napoleonic France did have that was kind of negative was tight control over newspapers. There wasn't a complete freedom of the press, and the use of secret police to keep down rebellions. Napoleon's empire. He conquered Iberian and Italian peninsulas, the Netherlands. Napoleon was a prolific general who was able to conquer many lands as a result of him being in power. He forced Austria and Prussia to enter into an alliance with him. He tried to invade Russia in 1812. He eventually will burn Moscow, but is defeated by the Russian winter. Now, Napoleon was kind of, what's a good word? Strong-willed and hard-headed. Napoleon wanted to invade Russia, and the Russians were not really well equipped to fight Napoleon. He had a very strong army, very advanced weaponry, and the Russians basically had a bunch of peasants living in towns along the way to Moscow. One way to defeat Napoleon, which was very effective, was to instruct the peasants living in Russia to basically burn all of the towns along the way to Napoleon. So let's say you're a Russian peasant living in 1812, Russia. You are maybe 100 miles from Moscow, and you hear Napoleon is coming. one of the people, the government bureaucrats from Moscow, comes to your town and says, all right, guys, here's the problem. Napoleon's coming, and when he gets here, he's going to stab all of you and kill all of you, or even if he doesn't, he might just capture you and do some bad things to you. So here's what you need to do. You can come with us to Moscow, but what you need to do before you come with us is you have to burn everything in your village to the ground. Leave nothing for him and his troops to basically plunder. The way Napoleon worked was he was really good at making his troops march, and as they took towns, they were able to plunder it for wheat and for cows and for grain and for different things that his troops needed to use. But by burning everything and killing all the livestock and destroying all the crops, Napoleon's army had to march farther and farther and farther away. Napoleon didn't have a very good supply chain that followed him. And over time, Napoleon had dwindling supplies. He eventually does make it to Moscow and burns it. But on his way back, as he's basically low on supplies, low on morale from his troops, the Russians then turn and counterattack and slowly do raids into Napoleon's troops, kind of slowly whittling away as he marches out of Russia. The British, Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies forced Napoleon to abdicate. It took 4 different armies to come together to get Napoleon to finally give up the throne. They surrounded France and forced him to go into exile. Now, Napoleon is willing to accept defeat, but many people were afraid around Europe that if Napoleon was killed as a result of this abdication, that the French people would just basically go into all-out revolt. So the people of the British leaders, the Austrian leaders, Prussian leaders, Russian leaders agreed that what we're going to do is take Napoleon to an island called Elba. We'll build him a nice thing there for him to live in, a house. He can have visitors, and he can just live there till he dies. He'll no longer be in charge, but at least we'll prevent a revolt and a rebellion. However, he escapes for about 100 days, known as Napoleon's 100 Days, and he takes power and gets his armies back and starts a big attack back towards the British. He's finally defeated by the British at the town of Waterloo, and he's exiled to another island called St. Helena and dies there in 1821. Here's Napoleon Empire at its height in 1812. You can see all of the orange are nominal or sort of allies of Napoleon. The purple are people who are in direct war with Napoleon. The beige are people who don't really care about him. Green is the French Empire that he built, and the light green are dependent states based on his alliances that he had built with them. We next move on to the revolutions in Haiti, or the revolutions in Latin America. The revolution in Haiti is the only successful slave revolt. We talked about the Spartacus revolt back in Rome and how it was effective at killing a number of Romans, but it wasn't effective in actually freeing the slaves who began the revolt. This revolution in Haiti, however, of African slaves who had been brought there through triangle trade, was the only successful slave revolt we have on record. The island of Hispaniola was originally a Spanish colony of Saint-Domingue in the east, now known as the Dominican Republic, and the French colony of Saint-Dominique in the west, now known as Haiti. It was a very rich Caribbean colony. It produced sugar, coffee, cotton, all the raw materials that the New World and the Old World wanted as part of triangle trade. Almost 1/3 of France's foreign trade came through what is now Haiti, or Saint-Dominique at the time. Society in Saint-Dominique, there were only 40,000 white French settlers, dominated the social structure. They were at the very top. There were 28,000 gens de couleur, free people of color, mixed race, or free slaves. And they also had small plots of land that they could farm on as free citizens living there. There were, at the same time, 500,000 slaves. They had a high mortality rate. Many fled to the mountains. They were known as maroons, or escaped slaves. This high mortality rate came because of the violent and horrible conditions that the slaves were living in. In Saint-Dominique, slaves were oftentimes shot. They had, when they would not work hard, they were beaten. They had a number of violence perpetrated on them by the white French settlers. And the high mortality rate came from, example, one story is slaves who were processing sugarcane, they had these big rollers that they would throw the stripped sugarcane into, and it would crush the sugarcane, extracting the pulp or the juice from inside of it, and that would then be boiled and created into sugar that you put in, for example, your coffee. Well, if slaves were working on that and their arm got stuck in the rollers, many slave owners, rather than stopping the production and trying to save the slave's arm, would just have this special knife alongside and just cut their arm clean off the bone. This was a horrific way to live. Many slaves lost limbs. Many of them died of exhaustion from working 15-hour days in the hot sun with very little food and water. And so the society in Saint-Domingue was one of injustice and one of horrible living conditions for those slaves. The revolt. It's inspired by the American and French Revolution. 500 gens de couleur sent to fight the British in the American War of Independence come back with an understanding of what had just happened in both the American War and what was starting to be talked about in France. By 1789, white settlers demand self-rule, but with no equality for gens de couleur. In 1791, the gens de couleur fight the white settlers, and a civil war breaks out on the island. The slaves, seeing an opportunity, revolt under the voodoo priest named Boukman, and they are able to overthrow both the gens de couleur, the freed African former slaves, or also the white French settlers. The French, British, and Spanish forces attempt to intervene because they see this as a huge threat to not only their colonial holdings, but also their structure of triangle trade through the use of slavery. François-Dominique Toussaint, in 1744 to 1803, he renames himself L'Ouverture, the opening, in 1791. He's a descendant of slaves, and he's freed in 1776. He helped his original owners escape, then joined the rebel forces. He built an army of 20,000, eventually dominating Saint-Domingue. 1801, he is able to promulgate a constitution of equality for Haiti. In 1802, he's arrested by Napoleon's forces and dies in jail. French troops are finally driven out, and in 1804, Haiti declares independence from France. Latin American society, 30,000 peninsulares, or colonial officials from the Iberian Peninsula. 3.5 million Creoles, born in the Americas of Spanish-Portuguese descent. They are a privileged class, but with grievances with the Peninsulares. They see the Peninsulares as basically thinking that they're better than the Creoles because they come from the Iberian Peninsula, even though they're of the same ethnic background. 1810 to 1825, they lead movements for Creole-dominated republics. 10 million others join them. African slaves, mixed-race populations. Mexican independence. Napoleon's invasion of Spain and Portugal in 1807 weakens royal authorities in the colonies. Again, Mexico is a Spanish colony. Priest Miguel Hidalgo, in 1753 to 1811, leads a revolt. Hidalgo is captured and executed, but the rebellion continues as he is seen as a martyr for Mexican independence. Creole General Agustin de Iturbide, 1783 to 1824, declares independence in 1821. He installs himself as the Emperor of Mexico, and he's deposed in 1823, and the Republic is finally established of Mexico. Southern regions form a federation, then divide into Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. We then get the man named Simón Bolívar. He led independence movements in South America. He's a native of Caracas, Venezuela. He was influenced by the Enlightenment and by George Washington. He rebels against Spanish rule in 1811 and forced into hiding. He forms alliances with many Creole leaders such as José de San Martín and Bernardo O'Higgins in Chile and Argentina, respectively, and Spanish rule is destroyed in South America by 1825. Now, with Simón Bolívar being the leader of this newly formed Latin America or South American area, he starts to say, what should we do? What should it look like? How about it should look like a lot like the American U.S. states? So Bolívar helped to form a U.S.-style federation. He wanted Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador to form Gran Colombia, and he actually accomplishes this. He attempts to bring in Peru and Bolivia, but there were strong political differences, and his idea or dream of Gran Colombia disintegrates. Bolívar goes into self-imposed exile and dies of TB. Brazilian independence. Napoleon's invasion sends Portuguese royal court into exile in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. In 1821, the king returns, and son Pedro is left behind as regent, or ruler, in his absence. Pedro negotiates with the Creoles and declares the independence of Brazil. he becomes Emperor Pedro I. What's interesting about this is by Pedro being left in Brazil and negotiating with the Creoles, Pedro sees an opportunity for himself to become a king in his own right and have his own land without his father really being over him, and is crowned Emperor Pedro as a result. The social structure remains largely intact, and there's not a huge amount of change as a result of Brazilian independence. Latin America in 1830. You can see independent Latin American states in 1830 are in orange. We have Empire Brazil, we have Mexico, Venezuela, Gran Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala City, Veracruz, British Honduras, all these different places. You can see the original area in purple, bottom left of the slave result, and you can see the border of Saint-Domingue and the border of Haiti, Saint-Domingue. The emergence of ideologies. We next get to conservatism. Edmund Burke is a proponent of a new ideology called conservatism. His belief is that revolutionary change is kind of shocking to the system, and one thing that governments can't handle is shock. If you look at France, if you look at the Americas, we need to kind of slow down these radical changes. People died as a result of these radical changes, and what we need to do is have a slow evolution of society. Yeah, there's probably some good ideas. Maybe allowing votes for people, maybe doing certain things, but they argued that we need to go slowly. We need to think about this carefully. We need to try and prevent death and destruction and chaos, and the way to do that is to not always give people what they're demanding, because that might lead to just anarchy. At the same time, there was a movement of liberalism, these liberals saw themselves as fighting against what conservatives were doing, because they thought conservatives were basically defending that you conservatives say that you like slow change because that means that you're going to lose power. If you're somebody who already can vote and is already in government and you're a conservative, well, of course you're going to say that you want it to go slow, because that just means less power for you if we enact the things we want to do and change. So the liberals wanted more radical changes. They wanted to manage, however, not stifle social change. They thought government's role was to kind of step in and say, oh, okay, you can have these rights, but we need to have structures, we need to have organization around it to allow that change to occur. We then get some new ideas, specifically the ideology of utilitarianism, proposed by a man named John Stuart Mill. Next, I have a very famous philosophical problem that John Stuart Mill talked about, and it is a very easy way to sum up some of his ideas of utilitarianism.
A runaway train is heading towards 5 workers on a railway line. There's no way of warning them, but you're standing near a lever that operates some points. Switch the points, and the train goes down a spur. Trouble is, there's another worker on that bit of track too, but it's 1 fatality instead of 5. Should you do that? Many people think the right thing to do would be to switch the points, to sacrifice 1 to save 5, since that produces the best outcome possible. Now imagine the train heading for the workers again. This time it can only be stopped by pushing a very large man off a bridge. His great bulk would stop the train, but he'd die. Should you do that? Most people say no. But why not? Both thought experiments are cases of sacrificing 1 to save 5. What the trolley problem examines is whether moral decisions are simply about outcomes or about the manner in which you achieve them. Some utilitarians argue that the 2 cases are not importantly different from each other. Both have similar consequences, and consequences are all that really matter. In each case, 1 person dies and 5 are saved, the best option in each harrowing situation. But lots of people say they would switch the points, but they wouldn't push the man off the bridge. Are they simply inconsistent, or are they onto something?
So, pretty crazy, huh? The end of the slave trade. Campaign to end slavery begins in the 18th century. Olada Equino in 1745 to 1797. It gains momentum after the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. Many of these revolutionaries were unable to justify their new Enlightenment ideals based on the idea that all men are created equal and that basically class structure and society makes us different, but that essentially we are all the same human beings in the same human family. And if that was the case, then there isn't really a way to enslave others that really makes any sense. We get a man named William Wilberforce in England, 1759 to 1833. He's a philanthropist, or basically a very rich professional good guy. and he succeeds in having Parliament outlaw the slave trade in 1807. Other states follow suit, but its illegal trade continues until 1867. End of the institution of slavery. In Haiti, the institution of slavery ends with the revolution. Mexico, slavery is abolished in 1829, partially to stop U.S. development of slave-based cotton industry in Mexico. Mexico was trying to slow down American imperialism into their country. In 1833, Britain abolishes slavery, offers compensation to former owners for that process. Other states follow, but offer freedom without equality. Property requirements, for example, literacy tests, block voting, property requirements that Britain allows slaves to be free if they are able to save enough money to buy property. They also have to get literacy tests, meaning they're able to be free if they're able to learn to read and write. And they're also forced into what's known as block voting, meaning that all former slaves get to vote only as one group, not with individual rights to vote by themselves. Enlightenment ideals and women. Enlightenment thinkers remain conservative regarding women's rights. Ironically, these radicals felt that women's rights was not something that was very high on their priorities. They thought that men should have more rights, men should have more equality, more suffrage in terms of voting, but they weren't really big on caring so much if women got more rights. Rousseau argues women should receive education to prepare for lives as wives and mothers. Rousseau said that women needed to be well educated so they could help teach children and be able to listen to their husbands and be able to talk with them and not be just pretty things that didn't understand what was going on. He thought that there was an end that justified their means rather than having education for the sake of education, that women are equal to men. Mary Estelle in England between 1666 and 1731 argues that women are essentially born into slavery. If you don't get to vote, you are told what to do. You don't get to really choose what you do once you're married. You don't really get to choose many things in your lives. How is that any different than being a slave? We then get Mary Wollstonecraft in England in 1759 to 1797, who writes a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792 and says that women should have equal rights. Women are by many degrees equal to men, and just kind of furthers the argument that women deserve equal protection and treatment under the law. The reason this is important is she uses Enlightenment ideals and reasoning to argue for her case. Women in the Revolution. Women are active in all phases of the French Revolution. Women storm Versailles, the palace, in 1789 and demand food. They think that Marie Antoinette, the queen of France during this time, is hoarding bread, and so they break into her palace and try and find it and kill her. The Republican Revolutionary women patrol the streets of Paris with firearms. They're given very high status with lots of power to do this. Yet few hold official positions of authority, such as voting rights. The revolution grants equality in education, property, legalized divorce, yet women are not allowed to vote. The major task of the 19th century, and in the U.S. we'll get to someone in next year known as Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She petitions for women's right to vote during this time in the United States. Nations and nationalism. A nation is this new idea that starts to come up during this time. A nation is a type of community. It's especially prominent in the 19th century. Before, we talked about empires, and we talked about societies that were structured around a king or around a group of people or a leader. And now we're getting to a nation that's a little bit different in terms of the way it ideologically and politically sees itself. It's distinct from a clan, a religious, or regional identities. It's usually based on shared language, customs, values, and historical experience. So these are groups of people who already speak the same language, they already have similar social structures, they have similar values in how they look at the world, and they have a historical history that binds them all together. Sometimes there's a common religion, but not always. The idea of a nation has immediate relationship with political boundaries. How we understand our society and our nation comes in a lot to do with our political borders. For example, in the United States, you learned in the past about manifest destiny. The idea that the Americans believed that it was the God-given right of all Americans to move from the east coast of the original 13 colonies from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and to kind of organize the United States of America into that structure politically. This is based on the idea that all people within the United States shared a common language. They had common customs, values, and historical experience. and it actually starts to form a new way of looking at the world in terms of a nation. All right, so next up we get some types of nationalism. There's cultural nationalism, which started with Johann Gottfried von Herder, 1744 through 1803. He praises the Volk, or the people. So his idea is that there is a sense of people based on some of the things we talked about before with like cultural identity, some religious background, some language things, that through this process of having all those things aligned, there is a group that are known as the people, or the people that represent the like purest sense of what it means to be, for example, German, or what it means to be French. And by having a common culture, a common language, customs, and so forth, you have a spirit of those people that is created. He goes on to further say that like through literature, folklore, and music, these are expressions of the Volksgeist, or spirit of the people, what they are about. If you think about our culture in America and what are some of the things that we are kind of obsessed with, you can kind of look at things like on television, the books we read, the music we listen to, the types of lives and jobs that we kind of hold in high esteem. Those are things that kind of give a spirit or a sense of what it means to be American. And through listening to or watching or reading those things, you kind of get the value system and the cultural aesthetic that goes along with it to understand what it means to truly be an American. Especially if, for example, you listen to country music, you might see America as like a very truck riding and living out in the country and, you know, hanging out with your friends on a Friday night by the river. Whereas if you listen to rap, you might think that everybody has a gun and everybody is, you know, selling drugs on the corner. Or if you listen to pop music, you might think everybody has, neon like eyeshadow on. But those different expressions of who we are kind of also give a deeper sense of, for example, of multiculturalism. I could go on talking about this, but this idea of having a sense of who we are based around those expressions through art and other forms of cultural expression create a sense of the culture as a whole. We then go on to political nationalism, a movement for political independence of a nation from other authorities. We will talk a little bit about Greece and how Greece was actually being occupied by Ottoman bureaucrats under the Ottoman Empire. One of the things that the Greeks start to say to themselves during this time is that, hey, we come from a culture of Greece. We no longer want to see ourselves as being occupied by the Ottomans, who culturally don't have anything to do with us. They're Muslim. We are historically Christians. They speak Turkish, and we speak Greek, and so they also have different cultural arts and different historical connections, and so eventually the Greeks get a political fervor of through nationalism to actually overthrow some of the Ottoman Empire's troops that are in their area, and they reclaim Greece as an independent nation from the Ottoman Empire. There's unification of national lands based on some of those ideas that I just talked about. And one famous person is Giuseppe Mazzini. He talks about young Italy as being a place of connection where we make Italy young again through the process of connecting people back to one unified Italy. Nationalism and anti-Semitism. Nationalist ideologies are distrustful of indigenous minorities. After the year 70 and the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in Jerusalem, the Jews go through what's called the diaspora. And the diaspora is the spreading out of Jews throughout all lands, basically in the Near East and as far as Europe. One of the major settling grounds for many Jews were cultural centers such as Venice and Western Europe like France, and they basically were a persecuted minority for many, many years. They then eventually were able to assimilate under different regimes, under different empires, and in many ways they were not really distinguishable from many other of their countrymen living in different areas, except for the fact that they were Jewish. Now, as nationalism arose, they start to argue that Jews are not the ones that belong here. They see, for example, in places like France, that there is a cultural sense of being French. There's a language. There's a historical sense of identity coming all the way back to when Julius Caesar was attacking the Gauls. And those French nationalists start to argue that, hey, wait a minute, there are a group of people living amongst us that are not the ones that were here from the very beginning. They don't really identify as French. They don't partake in the same French activities all the time. They also have their own religion that's kind of separate from ours. They don't actually see themselves as French, and so maybe they're not part of us. And so they have these things through nationalism that's known as anti-Semitism. A Semite is someone who's Jewish. Nationalists create what's called pogroms, which are violent attacks on Jewish communities in the Russian Empire, beginning around 1881. There are different times and at different instances where Jews were attacked. They weren't necessarily called pogroms, but I will use that word many times interchangeably for basically persecution of Jews as like a riotous sense, that they would go into their communities. Many times Jews lived in their own communities, separate from the main cities or separate from the main parts of towns, and they would burn down the village where the Jews lived, or they would just steal things and cause general just havoc for Jews living in the area. Anti-Semitism is a rallying cry of many European nationalists. Their argument is that we need to get rid of some of those people who are not like us, and it's easily identifiable, the Jews, as a group that they see as not being French, for example, or not being German, or not being British. Many different European cultures had different reactions to anti-Semitism. Some were small scale, some were large scale. Some of the larger scale ones did take place in places like Russia, and some of the smaller scale ones kind of pop up in random areas where there's enough Jews to cause enough of a stir through this process. French military captain Alfred Dreyfus was framed for selling military secrets to Germany. This is a famous example of anti-Semitism in a case that actually created quite a stir during its time. So French military captain Alfred Dreyfus rose to the ranks as a military captain, was part of the French army. His family saw themselves as French, and he's accused, probably surreptitiously, probably falsely accused. From everything we understand about history, it was more than likely he was falsely accused for selling military secrets to Germany. Many French nationalists saw this as a betrayal of the French ideas and being French, and they thought that, see, this Jewish officer that we've made captain in the French army, we can't trust him, and so he actually was kicked out of the army, and eventually he was exonerated. But there was a great debate on the loyalty of Jews in European societies. Many European nationalists said that Jews can't be trusted. They are not from here. They have no allegiances except for themselves. And so we really shouldn't allow them to live in our country, because there is a threat that they could be working for the highest bidder, and that might not be in our best case, or best interest. So as a response to this, Jews start to think a little bit about what it would look like if Jews were able to have a country of their own. After the Diaspora of 70, they start to say, maybe we need to find a Jewish homeland. Thus, Zionism is born. Theodor Herzl is from Austria in 1860 to 1904. He's a journalist at the Dreyfus trial. He observed that there was an intense mob of anti-Semitism, and he concluded that the Enlightenment and Revolution could not solve this human ill. One of the big things he takes away is that no matter how much people are talking about enlightenment and logic and reason, that people were not going to resolve their anti-Semitic beliefs. They worked to create a refuge for Jews by reestablishing the Jewish state in Palestine, or also known as Israel today. Zion is synonymous with the word Jerusalem, and so they believed that they needed to return home and make a state that is known as Jerusalem. Regardless of the political climate today, many Jews still believe this and still refer to the area as Israel. I'll refer to it interchangeably as Jerusalem, Palestine, Israel, so don't take this as any political affiliation in any way. In 1897, he convened the world's first Zionist organization conference, and they met together to discuss what it could look like to have a Jewish state. Next, we get to the Congress of Vienna. There was a big sense in the European nations that after Napoleon, there were some issues. First of all, they saw the destructive nature that one European power could have on another, and they began to question what it could look like if they were able to create an alliance system or a structure by which all of Europe could get together on the same page to not allow the same level of war and destruction that came as a result of Napoleon. So the great European powers of the day send different representatives to Vienna, and they meet to talk about what they can do to basically accomplish two things. Number one, limit the power that France could have, because it had been seen as a disturbing influence on Europe at this time, not only for Napoleon, but also thinking back to the French Revolution and the death of their kings. Many of these were noblemen who thought, yeah, they started killing some of the nobles. I don't want that to come back. So one of the leaders during this meeting, Prince Clemens von Metternich of Austria, who was alive from 1773 to 1859, he supervises the dismantling of Napoleon's empire. He places certain restrictions on France. He gives land away from France into Germany and into different places, and his idea was to establish a balance of power. He wanted to create a system by which no one in continental Europe could be more powerful than the other, that each group would basically be about the same footing, and kind of having a reset to the whole structure so that there could be a sense of balance and unity amongst Europe, and they could kind of put those old wars that we didn't really talk a ton about. If you study European history, there were tons of wars we skipped over, but they wanted to put all those wars behind them and move forward. They established this balance of power, and they worked to suppress the development of nationalism among multinational empires like the Austrian Empire. Metternich was very fearful that in Austria, where there were multinational and multi-ethnic peoples living in his empire, that the ideas of nationalism could start revolutions and rebellions that could eventually lead to him being thrown out or even his death. So the idea is the Congress of Vienna would establish this balance so that those people would not be empowered to have a rallying cry around nationalism. Nationalist rebellions. The Greeks in the Balkans Peninsula seek independence from the Ottoman Turks in 1821. With European help, the Greeks achieves independence in 1830. There's rebellions all over Europe, especially in 1848. Rebels take Vienna, Metternich resigns and flees, and rebellion is put down by 1849. And so for our last section, we're going to talk about the unifications of Italy and Germany. Italy and Germany formerly were disunited groups of regional kingdoms, city-states, and ecclesiastical states. If you go back, especially in Germany, to the time we talked about with Martin Luther, the reason why Martin Luther was able to be so successful at his Protestant Revolution that he didn't know he was even starting was that he was given protection by different German princes living in the area around where he was preaching and teaching. What was very clear and apparent to you then should be clear and apparent now, that Germany never really unified as one central government, but rather was a lot of different small states, principalities, small kingdoms, regional like lordships, and by having this disjointing, the German people all spoke German, they all practiced the same customs, and as nationalism creeps into these areas, specifically Germany and Italy, people start to argue that why are we different states and different groups? Why don't we just unify under one group, and that way we'll be much stronger, basically creating a gang of states, which is a federation. Germany, over 300 semi-autonomous jurisdictions. There were loose affiliations, loose overarching groups that oversaw larger areas, but it was pretty much semi-autonomous for most of Germany. Nationalist sentiment develops the ideas of unification, and over in Italy, Count Camillo di Cavour, 1810 to 1861, and Giuseppe Garibaldi from 1807 to 1882 unify Italy under King Vittorio Emanuele II. Giuseppe Garibaldi, very interesting guy. You should look him up. He probably, side historical note, convinced Lincoln to actually put the moral clause of eliminating slavery as a part of the Union's effort to win the Civil War. So, very interesting guy. Here's a map of the unification of Italy and Germany. There's Piedmont, Sardinia, 1889. Here's the areas, all kind of annexed. And then the purple represents where Italy actually sets up its boundary at 1924. Unifications of Italy and Germany continued. Otto von Bismarck, shown here on the right, looks like a cheerful man, advances the idea of real politics, the politics of reality, uses war with neighbors to unify Germany. Here's how it works. Otto von Bismarck was very big into the idea of blood and iron. The things that make people unify are the things that kind of like red meat and just like manly kind of things that make people come together. He saw that when people were at war with one another, he was able to kind of unify them around the idea of German nationalism, that people should come together to defend Germany, her history, to defend German ideology, German culture, and as they rally around it, they can find unity and brotherhood in the process of not just defending themselves, but also their neighbors and making one unified Germany. So through wars with others, he's able to unify Germany around himself and around this new structure of what is now quickly becoming Germany. He proclaims that he has created the Second Reich in 1871, with the Holy Roman Empire being the first, Reich or reign, and it falls under King Wilhelm I, who is named Emperor. So we have made it. Very long chapter. When you finish studying this chapter, you should be able to do the following. Identify the connections between the Enlightened and revolutionary ideas. So you got to go back a little bit and check those out. Next, compare and contrast the American and French revolutionary experiences. Slightly different, but very influential in a number of ways. And if you look at our chart we hopefully drew at the beginning, you'll have some better understanding of that. Number 3, explain the achievements and legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte in world history. I would Google that and look in your book. Number 4, explain the course and significance of the Haitian Revolution and the South American Wars of Independence. Go back a couple slides, you'll figure that out. Number 5, distinguish key aspects of classical conservatism and liberalism. Easy peasy. 6, explain the emergence of rights groups such as abolitionists and women's rights activists. Easy. 7? No. Yeah, 7. Explain the origins of nations and nationalism. 9. 8. I don't know. Whatever. Compare and contrast the emergence of national communities across the 19th century Europe. Compare and contrast the unifications of Italy and Germany. All right, for your writing assignment, 5 to 8 sentences. Number 1, compare the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen with the Declaration of Rights of Women and Female Citizen. You can Google those, as given in the text. Did Olympia de Gaulle simply add the word women to the original declaration, or did she substantially change the meaning and the concept of the citizenship in her declaration? Did she speak from the traditions of the Enlightenment, or did she challenge those traditions? Number 2, under the Ancien regime, the state was generally defined as the domain of the sovereign. How was this definition changed by the American and French revolutions? What are the elements of a national identity in the modern world? What is the place of minorities such as the Jews within this new concept of nationality? Number 3, compare the positions of a conservative and liberal in the 19th century on the nature of political authority and political change. What would each ideology say about abolition of slavery? What about women's rights? As always, it's been very fun talking to you. I hope you learned a lot. We got through about 60 slides. It's a pretty long chapter. Make sure you reread. This is one of the most tightly packed chapters with a lot of ideas flying around. Hope this works out for you. See you guys again soon. Bye.
What we do here is go back.